Hello and welcome everyone to the Sheffield University Philosophy Department seminar. It's our great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Carrie Fidgor, who's a professor at the University of Iowa. She specializes in philosophy of mind, cognitive science, neuroscience, philosophy of science, philosophy of language and metaphysics, and neuroethics, and is the author of Pieces of Mind, The Proper Domain of Psychological Predicates, which came out from OUP in 2018. And today, Professor Fidgor will be speaking to us on the topic, what could cognition be, if not human cognition? Welcome, Professor Fidgor.
Thank you. Okay, so let me figure out here. Start, present. Okay, so see you in about 45 minutes. Okay. Share that. Let me get that. Okay, so you should be looking at the introductory slide. Is everything fine?
All fine, yes, thank you. That's great.
Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me and for showing up for this virtual talk. This is my sort of current research following up the book, Pieces of Mind. Kind of trying to understand even at a deeper level what, how we should be thinking about the foundations of cognition or cognitive science, psychology. I'll sort of use those as more or less the same. For the purposes of this talk, differences between, say, cognitive science and psychology won't matter. So let me just, first part, sort of what's the issue here? What are the symptoms that I'm noticing and that I want to respond to? So as you know from the title, probably, there's a famous paper by Tim van Gelder, which had a very similar title. And in his perspective, what could cognition be if not computationalism? And what he was suggesting there was that basically it could be dynamical systems theory, if not classical computationalism or connectionism, right? So it's the computational theories, and he's contrasting that with dynamical systems theory. Here, in terms of the explanans, the theoretical background is just, it's evolution, if not the Scala naturae. And I will explain why that is the case in the course of the talk. But that's the sort of the general theoretical background that is being contrasted here. But the real difference here that I'm interested in is in the explanandum. Right. And here we're talking about cognitive capacities. I'm not going to talk about concepts today. So it'll be capacities or traits, or in biology, characters. All of those will be functions, if you want to say cognitive function. All of those will be equivalent for my purposes. And so from Tim, again, going back to Van Gelder's paper, he presents the dynamical systems theory, and he uses a special case as an example. He takes some models of human decision making, and he's using that as his paradigm, an example of what he calls and what we generally call high-level cognitive functioning. And what I want to do here is to talk about, for example, decision making, where we're not talking about decision making from the perspective of any one species, let alone the human species, as the sort of paradigm. So that's kind of the change that I'm interested in, is going from thinking about cognition from a human's perspective to going to it from a species neutral perspective, as I also say. So you might say, because, I'm saying contrasting in a way evolution with the Scala naturae, I mean, the Scala naturae was, rendered obsolete in theory or in principle, at least 160 years ago, right? And, Dobzhansky who was one of the creators, I guess, of the modern synthesis regarding biology, wrote this famous paper called "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." Right. So all of biology, you need to think of it in terms of this background evolutionary theory. And very recently, Krishna and Henrik have said, this idea of, nothing in psychology makes sense except in the light of evolution. This way of thinking about ourselves, other creatures, is just as much a matter of psychology as it is about anatomy or physiology. And what's interesting is that, Dobzhansky also thought, and in this very famous paper, says, Homo sapiens is the apex of evolution and a tremendous biological success. There is no apex to evolution. Every species that is currently alive is a biologic success. And in other works, he also thinks that human culture is non-biological, and that the human mind is some sort of a transcendence. And as much, oops, what did I just do? Okay, human culture is a transcendence and a radical innovation on a par with the origin of life. So in other words, you had the origin of life was this, really radical change or difference. And then, the human species, and along with its very special human mind, was similarly, as much of a radical innovation. And this suggests, of course, that, there's something super, super special about us, even though, every single species that currently exists is a success. And every species that exists currently, or ever actually, is unique, right? So just saying that we are unique is just saying, well, so what? I mean, every species is unique, right? So what there seems to be is instead this persisting effort to, in a sense, justify our sort of special uniqueness, right? We're unique in a unique way, or something like that. And this has a long history, right? So long after the Scala Naturae was allegedly made obsolete, we were still looking, we were still thinking in terms of man the tool maker, right? And, it wasn't basically until Jane Goodall, found evidence of observing her chimps in the Gambia region, that actually chimps made and used tools, right, to fish for termites. And so there was a lot of debate in response to her. Were her observations too subjective, and so on and so forth. But eventually, obviously, people accepted that man the tool maker is just not a good way to think about what makes us specially unique. And in fact, I've seen recently. Okay, so we're not the only tool maker, but we're the only one that can make multi-purpose tools, right? So again, there's this tendency to, if you don't get it right with this one particular trait, let's go to some really specific sort of version of that trait. And you see that, not just, okay, tool making, fine. But there's also this persisting look for, some sort of higher capacity that sets us apart from the rest of biology, or biologically evolved creatures. One, of course, is language. And there, because there's been a lot of discoveries in terms of animal communication systems, including abilities to combine different, recombinable elements. So that has, where we are in terms of how different we are with language is kind of up in the air. And one of the, more recent papers, Michael Corballis, summarizing that research, he suggests, it looks like really language, we need to think of it as a communicative tool, right? So just another fancy tool for expressing our thoughts. Okay, so it's really not language as such. Another proposal by David Premack and others is that we alone have future planning, the ability to plan for the future. And then, of course, you've got plenty of evidence of corvids and other animals that have that are able to plan for the future. And then there's again a response to say, well, this is Premack's own view, they can plan for specific things, but our capacity is somehow domain general, right? Without defining exactly what that means. Another special capacity we were supposed to have was abstract reasoning. Unfortunately, it turns out that, bees, for example, are able to discriminate between like same and different, right? Among other species. And so then, here in this case, the idea is, well, they can reason abstractly, but they can't do it in these particular ways. They can't develop functional categories or structural categories. They're always dependent on perception. So you have a whole series of capacities, and as soon as they find something that seems to be, in some sense, continuous with what other, not what non-human animals have, we kind of, shift the goalpost to something even more kind of specific in this, seemingly never-ending sense to somehow justify our special uniqueness, right? And the latest thing, is this idea of cultural transmission, so that it's not so much a particular capacity we have, like future planning or something like that. It's the fact that we are able to copy each other to a very high fidelity degree, and then as a result, we can have various forms of cumulative knowledge, right? All right, so there's a lot of tools that we've got for doing that. And this is what makes us uniquely unique. And I should say, behind all these efforts to find something either cognitive or behavioral that is truly, in some sense, uniquely unique to us, you've got a lot of research in neuroscience where the human brain is used as a proxy for intelligence. And so there's been, again, I mean, for, at least since Darwin, the idea that, well, the reason why we are somehow, more intelligent uniquely is because our brains are bigger, which has turned out to be false. But then you change that and you say, well, it's bigger relative to body weight, right? And that's, I mean, it's certainly not out of bounds in terms of its relative size. Is it more packed with neurons, maybe per centimeter squared? Well, bird palladium, their an analog, I guess, of the human frontal cortex is also packed with neurons. So there's been again a very consistent effort to keep finding maybe in the brain something that can explain the vast difference between the way we cooperate and the way we have altered our environment, created tools, and so forth, right? None of which I am questioning, but it's just this effort to somehow justify our special uniqueness in some way. So again, it turns out the human brain is not vastly different from any other primate brain. It's just typically scaled. There's a primate brain, sort of template, and the human brain is one of those, right? So it's not like vastly different that would explain the vast differences in our behavior. And of course, intelligence itself is not directly related to brain structure anyway. It's mediated by goal states, by what's available in your environment, and of course the range of environments in which various capacities can be exercised. But behind all of these comparisons across species is this idea that the human capacity is somehow the standard for all of them. And this comes out in what's currently the debate in psychology, or at least comparative psychology, whether human and animal cognition are continuous or discontinuous. And I'll go into more detail about that later. But what Premack says, he's defending the idea that, we have this future planning state among others that other animals just don't match. And he says, it is essential when claiming human-like capacities in animals to ask this question: is the animal faculty equivalent to that of the human? And you might think, well, equivalence is is an equivalence relation, right? But as a matter of fact, there's an implicit asymmetry there, because you can think of, suppose you had asked this question, it is essential when claiming animal-like capacities in humans to ask this question: is the human faculty equivalent to that of the animal? And if that seems somewhat jarring, then that's exactly the point, is that, the human faculty is the one that the animal has to meet, not vice versa. So it's that role of the human mind as the standard for minds generally that breaks the symmetry of equivalence. So, it's like, where does this come from? Well, I think fundamentally, it comes from the Scala Naturae, and the way that, if you think of the Scala Naturae as sort of the foundation of a theoretical psychology, right, for all of nature, that idea that humans have reason, mind, nous, whatever you want to call it, and there's a scale of being that orders everything, actually, all being, from rocks all the way up to God. But if you just kind of leave off the divinities and then the rocks at the bottom, you get a scale of nature, right? The great chain of being, where humans are at the top. Everything else is ordered by their degree of perfection in relation to God. And what makes us more perfect than any other living creature, of course, is that we have reason and others don't. And this, of course, goes back in its fundamentals to Aristotle, but as a fully kind of elaborated theoretical schema, it wasn't until like the Middle Ages and after, right? So what you have here, what I want to look at is, what is it about the way we think about cognition that we have, despite everything, kind of, still are structured in the way we think by this Scala Naturae, and in particular, the issues of how we think about, how we characterize or define, and how we individuate cognitive characters or traits or properties. Pick your favorite language, and then cognitive concepts that refer to these, although I'm not going to talk about concepts today. So, how is the Scala still lingering in our thinking about cognition? And then what would it be for us to think about cognition from an evolutionary perspective? Okay, so that's in other words, what could cognition be if not human cognition? Okay, so second part, there's only two parts. Let me just give some more detail on what the Scala Naturae does for us as a theoretical foundation for psychology or cognitive science or cognition. So, I'll be brief here. This is kind of a common story. You had species, right, in the ladder, individuated by their species essences, right? It's ahistorical, right? It's eternal. There's a linear ordering of species. From, as I mentioned before, degree of perfection of being, the more perfect is, of course, is literally higher, which is why, of course, we're still calling, cognition, certain aspects of it higher cognition, right? That comes directly from the Scala. So we have higher cognition, which in the latter is restricted to human beings. Again, if you set aside divinities, right? So all the animals are, below us, and we have this higher, literally higher cognition. So how about evolution? Again, just overall. You have species individuation and characterization within a continuous evolutionary process, and it's extremely complicated, and it's very, controversial. Philosophers are biologists, and then if any of you are philosophers of biology, this is the species problem, right? How do we individuate species from this, continuous process of evolution? But, somehow, that is done. It's also a historical, right? Through time, right? So it's not an eternal, and it's bushy. It's not just a linear structure, the tree of life, so to speak, but it's bushier than a tree. And this is all just, sort of ancestor-descendant relationships, right? Between different species, right? And so the hierarchy here is not a hierarchy of being or perfection, but it's just, the evolved temporal relatedness between different species. And then, you have cognitive traits, right? Just as you have like a zillion other kinds of traits. And if we have any of them on our own, right, just us, it's an a posteriori matter. It's not built into phylogeny, okay, the way it is built into the latter. And I should point out, this means that however you define or characterize any type of cognitive traits, you have to do it species neutrally, right? You can't define them by the way the humans, by the way human beings exhibit a capacity, because if it's going to be a posteriori, it has to be possible for other species to have them. And if you define it in a way that only humans can have it, then by definition, no other species can have it. Okay, so you already, if you're going to be a posteriori about human cognitive uniqueness in any particular capacity, what it is that we have uniquely, that has to be not by definition, but because we have this capacity, we've defined it in some way that is not specific to us, and we've looked around and we've found humans are the only ones with it, which is perfectly possible. I mean, I'm certainly not ruling that out. Okay. So I should also mention just, what the Scala Naturae does not do as a theoretical psychology. It's compatible with materialism or physicalism. All you need to do really to make it compatible with physicalism is to give a appropriately naturalistic explanation of how the human mind emerged, right? And that's completely compatible with having a scale of that sort. And if the explanation relies just on evolutionary processes, then it's consistent with evolution, right? So you can have a theoretical psychology that is based in the Scala Naturae, that is nevertheless naturalistic and evolutionary in a sense that, you're explaining the emergence of this special human mind using only evolutionary tools. And that seems fine, except, even if you did make this naturalized Scala Naturae, you would still be importing into cognitive science or psychology a way of thinking about cognition that's inconsistent with evolution. Okay, so that's sort of what I want to get at, right? It's not the naturalization or lack thereof of the Scala, it's the way we're thinking about cognition that is inconsistent with the approach that we need to take for, from an evolutionary perspective. So what is that, right? So overall, within biology, if nothing in biology makes sense without evolution or only in the context of evolution, then, the overall theoretical task is you've got to think about, species, traits, whatever it is, in terms of descent with modification, right? That's your basic principle of evolution. And so the way you individuate your types of capacities, the way you individuate your species, all of that, and characterize them, that's the sort of guiding principle for your, however you individuate and however you characterize. So when you're talking about species, this is not, I'm not, focusing on this, but just so to give people an idea of what I am focusing on. When you're talking about species, people accept, you can't define them in terms of essences. There's not going to be any sort of sharp distinctions in general. People have suggested Boyd's homeostatic property cluster account, to individuate species. Some people have said, well, we should just be nominalist about species. Other people say, no, you should take the whole tree of life and then, somehow distinguish, segments of it, right? And the characters or, features that you use in order to, sort of make these distinctions between species come from, genetics and molecular differences. They come from, structural differences, body plan, things like that, organs, generative features, developmental trajectories, right? So from birth or even before until adult, right? All those sorts of developmental trajectories. And then, of course, behavioral characters, right? So how a thing actually behaves in its environment. So all these sorts of different, phenotypes and genotypes and everything else are all, part of the mix of how you're going to individuate species. When you're talking about traits or characters or properties, whatever, the important thing is allowable variation within each type, right? So whether it's like a behavioral phenotype or a gene, you need to understand what the type is within this idea of what I'm calling, it's a technical term, allowable variation. And that's because evolution selects out of variation, right? That's the modification part of descent with modification. You can only, have a selection process like evolution if things can differ a bit, right? And so that difference is what, evolutionary processes will select on. And that's what I'm calling allowable variation, because a lot of variation within each type, happens with every single generation, but it doesn't mean you have a new type. Okay, so there has to be a sense in which any type you create or identify, right? Any type you individuate and characterize has to allow for various variations that are within the type. So, of course, this raises the big question, right? When do you have traits, given this continuous process, that are the same or different, right? Given that, between parent and offspring, there's always differences, right? But not all of the differences matter for typing, right? For individuation. And what variation is what I'm calling allowable, and when have you sort of surpassed that range of variation to get a new trait, okay? Because that's, eventually you do get new traits, right? So this is, the sort of the task that I'm working on is, how do you do this? When do you have just a variation within an old trait, or when do you actually have a new trait? Okay, so let me just say, sort of general word about individuation of, cognitive traits in particular. You can certainly, everything that I'm saying is totally consistent with functionalism, which is the most popular way of individuating cognitive capacities, in terms of, inputs, outputs, and interrelationships, right? but it's substrate dependent, right? So people think about, functionalism. There's this idea that, it's substrate independent. You could have, pain or something like that, and a Martian can have it, an octopus could have it, all these different things, and the what the entity that has it is made of doesn't matter, right? So a lot of people, the slogan is functionalism defines capacities by what they do, not by what they're made of, right? But of course, if you're talking about biological creatures, right, not anything can count physically or biologically as a token of the kind of behavior that you're trying to use to identify the capacity. So, from a metaphysical perspective, sure, anything goes, just about. But from a physical perspective, or more specifically biological, it's not the case that everything goes, because structure and function co-evolve, right? The wing of a bat, right, is, analogous or, similar to hands with various webbing and so forth. And so you have a particular structure that's a little bit different from the previous generation, and it's so it can perform something a little bit different. And then because of that offspring might, live to, produce more offspring, which have that slight difference. And then, because of that slight difference, they have a better structure and so on. So it's a intertwined kind of relationship between the structures that we'll see today in a particular species and the functions that those structures are able to have. Okay, so just to, again, for concreteness, if you think one of the proposals about pain, for example, since that's a popular example for functionalism, is that we're only seeing pain in the sorts of entities that are capable of associative learning, right? Either a classical or operant. And so far as we know, the only creatures that are capable of associative learning have neurons, right? Now, this still leaves a very wide range of creatures, from nematodes, C. elegans, on up, as creatures that, could potentially have pain, at least on this theory. But it's not independent of what these things are made of. Okay, so one of the corollaries of this is that the way we happen to exhibit a particular trait, that's fine, but you can't assume, you can't take it as kind of given that that is the only way to do it, right? Again, no species is going to be, criterial or the prototype species or anything like that. Our, the way we behave is going to be one way to exhibit that trait, but there's no reason from biology that gives us the assumption that that's the only way it will ever be exhibited. Second thing is that the idea of the individuation of characters or traits and species is intertwined, right? And it's similar to the intertwining of structure and function, right? So homology, for example, so if you have two species, they have the same trait, you want to know, is the reason that they have the same trait because they share an ancestor, right? An immediate ancestor, okay? And if they do, right, then those traits are classified as homologies, right? And if they have the shared, so if you have a trait in two species that are homologous, right, that gives you a reason to think that we can fill out that part of the phylogenetic tree, right, with some phylogenetic hypothesis about how those two species are related. But I mean, as some of you have probably already figured out, which of the traits that are shared is going to depend, which of the shared traits, count as homologies, will depend on like how the species are related, right? In the past, are they two branches from the same parent, for example? So this problem. I mean, I've kind of spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out, where which comes first, and I've come to realize this is kind of a chicken and egg versus chicken and egg problem. And I don't have much more to say about that, but I don't think it's a vicious circle. I just think that there's a certain amount of clarification that needs to be made. I think this can be done more or less, in Neurath's boat fashion, where, you sort of have independent reasons to think that the two species have a common ancestor already, right, for independent reasons. Then you have this trait that they share, and you say, yes, well, those traits are homologous because they have that relationship, right? So there's probably a sense in which, you're sort of, you're looking at a particular trait, and you're sort of holding the rest of it, sort of constant. And then you kind of flip back and forth in that way. Final thing is that, and this is probably the most important point, is that descent with modification, right, does not entail a new trait or a new species with each generation, right? Parent and offspring they're always different. They're always different in a zillion different ways, right? But they're usually, right, the offspring is the same species, and they usually have the same traits with allowable variation, right? So, your height, your hair color, all these various things, you're the exact shape of your nose, everything, there's so much that's going to be very, very specific to you, but it's not like that is enough to make you a different species or to have a different trait. Okay, so there's sort of this continuity to a particular point, right? I mean, you can't just keep varying and varying and then just have like one big massive trait across all of phylogeny, right? There's obviously points at which the variation, you've kind of gone beyond the range of allowable variation. So if you're thinking of human cognitive capacities as autapomorphies, which are species-specific traits, right? So like only humans have such and such, right? Whatever it is. So there's three different conditions I think you need to meet, right? One is that this trait, whatever it is, episodic memory, or pick your capacity, it has to have surpassed the allowable variation from the ancestral trait, right? So there may be sort of intermediaries that are still within the allowable variation, and then you get this version that surpasses that range, okay? And that's what makes it a new trait. Second of all, this new trait itself has allowable variation. And that allowable variation will be both within the species, right? So different people have, slightly different episodic memory, capacities in various, dimensions, but also across species. So you can have a new trait in the same old species, right? And you can have a new trait in a new species. But even if you have a new trait in a new species, it doesn't mean that no other species can have it, right? So for example, you could have, again, two species that split off from a parent species, and both of them have this new trait, right? Two different species, new trait, okay. So they share the same trait, right? In fact, that's one way in which you can have a homology. So the newness of the trait does not mean that it has been thereby restricted to the species that has it, right? It has to have its own type of allowable variation, and that allowable variation has to be across species as well as within, okay? And then the third, of course, the a posteriori condition is that you actually do find this trait in only one species. It's not, defined specifically to a particular species. So let me just put, this a little bit flesh on this. So there's this debate, which you may or may not be aware of continuity versus discontinuity in terms of, our relationship to non-human entities and their cognitive capacities. So the people, in the continuity camp, or sometimes called difference of degree, they will say something like, the same trait is being found across species, like episodic memory. All of these will be allowable variations of that one trait, same trait. And there is no evidence, right, of autapomorphy, that, only one trait has it. For the discontinuity theorists, right, who also sometimes say difference in kind, the same trait could be found across species, each in their allowable species-specific variation, but in fact, it is found in just one in its allowable variation, right? There's a good and interesting non-cognitive example is, menopause. We thought, we thought for a while that humans, human females were the only females in sexual reproduction who had menopause. But it turns out that that's actually not true, right? That, killer whales undergo menopause, things like that. Okay, so that was a case where, again, you had a particular trait. It was thought to be only human, but in fact, it turned out not to be human. Okay, so the important thing from all of that is that evolutionary thinking versus Scala thinking divides individuation and characterization into, two basic questions, rather than just one in the Scala. So if you're asking, when do you have one type of trait or one species, when you have two, for evolution, right, they both share this question, what are the features that are going to characterize the trait or the species, if you're interested in species, right? The second thing is, what is the range of allowable variation of the trait within and across species, right? And that question doesn't really arise for the Scala Natura because you have essences, right? Whereas evolution depends on modification, because modification is what enables evolution, right? So that is, how you determine what the range of allowable variation is, given that there are no essences, and they're certainly not assigned species by species. That turns out to be the really difficult and important question. So let me just, I'll quickly go through an example, I think I have time, of episodic memory, right? So, how this way of thinking about cognition, how you put this debate in those terms. So Tulving, 1972, created this concept of episodic memory, which he defined initially as what, where, when memory, right? So memory of some, past episode, like, New Year's Eve last year or something, some party you went to or a class you took or, some particular event in your past, right? Obviously we all had this concept of episodic memory before he invented the term, but in any case. So then, go forward a couple decades, you have Clayton and Dickinson with a famous, paper where they reported finding that Western scrub jays, exhibited, were able to exhibit episodic memory, in terms of, where they had cached particular types of food, right? Some types, like worms, would decay. Others, like seeds and nuts, would not decay. And so they would preferentially sort of, go to find the worms first. And if a certain amount of time had passed, they wouldn't bother with the worms because they would know that, that will be bad. That food will be bad. I'll just go for the nuts. So that paper, spawned a whole bunch of, comparative and other studies of episodic memory in non-human animals. And cutting to the chase, by 2005, Tulving said, well, and not just Tulving, but what's essential to autonoetic consciousness, as opposed to, maybe merely semantic memory, is that, to episodic memory is what he calls autonoetic consciousness, and some other people call mental time travel, right? And his claim, so the idea is that you had to experience, you had what was essential to episodic memory, as opposed to just remembering what, where, when, right, which could just be a fact in a history book. Only humans have this mental time travel capacity. And he hastens to add, it's very interesting, that this idea that only humans have this is not a delayed rearguard action in support of the myth of the Scala Naturae, right? So he's saying, only we have it, but he's not presuming that, this is like by definition, right? It's just like, this is a hypothesis that we are the only ones who have it. So Clayton and Russell, respond, and they give a minimalist, what they call a minimalist definition of re-experiencing as what they call a perspectival memory trace. And that, so it's from the perspective of the individual that you have this experience. And they add, it's not necessarily within a background of self-awareness and other networks of conceptual abilities, as it would be in the case of human beings. So just to quote them, episodic memory involves an organism re-experiencing an earlier situation. So they're agreeing with Tulving that yes, it is a feature of episodic memory that you have to have this re-experiencing. But they add, just as human episodic memory will inherit what is present in human experience, so will avian episodic memory inherit the character of avian experience. So how I would put this in the terms that I was saying before is that they're saying episodic memory does require re-experiencing, because some people actually deny that. So they're agreeing with Tulving on that, but they're saying re-experiencing as a feature, as a type, can vary across species. In other words, corvid and human re-experiencing are both allowable variations of this single evolved character. Okay, so then if you think of, I mentioned the continuity versus discontinuity debate, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying one is correct and one isn't, but this is how I think the debate ought to be characterized. So the continuity theorists will say something like, with reference to the episodic memory case, they're saying something like, humans and scrub jays, they both have episodic memory in each of their allowable variations, but human episodic memory, outperforms scrub jay episodic memory, or scrub jay episodic memory outperforms human episodic memory on some scale, right? So there's a difference in degree. The assumption, again, this is just the assumption of, human superiority, is that, if there's a difference between the human and an animal, the human is always, higher on whatever scale, right? But of course, that's not built into the scale. That's a posteriori, if anything. The discontinuity theorist will say, scrub jays might have had episodic memory in their own allowable variation of that, but in fact, only humans do. And we have it in our allowable variation, right? And so another way to put that is to say, what scrub jays do have is a capacity that is outside the range of allowable variation for episodic memory. But, and this is the important part, that range is not fixed by the human variation or the human form. And it's that what makes this like, we're now thinking about cognition, and we're not thinking about cognition as just like human cognition. The human case is no longer sort of the standard for all of cognition. So that brings me to my end. Summary, main points. This human standard is the prototype, the thing against which everything else gets compared, as the, that, as far as I can tell, really does still linger from the Scala Naturae, is problematic, conceptually, but also in terms of the methodology of pursuing comparative research, which, I haven't gone into here, but there are other aspects as well. Second, evolutionary theory does require us to rethink about how we're thinking about these traits, particularly because we have to individuate them in ways that allow for, variation, because otherwise you just don't get evolution, right? And this way of thinking, evolutionary thinking, it detaches cognition from specifically human cognition, which is an allowable variation. But of course, that's a wider notion. And it makes possible that claims about human cognitive autapomorphies are actually like a posteriori truths. If they're true, they're not true by definition. So that is it. So thank you. I'm going to escape from this. And let me see what I can do here. I will stop sharing, I guess. How do I do that? Stop presenting. There we go. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Hope that was okay time-wise, I think.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. So we'll follow our tradition and have a short break now.
Okay.
We'll reconvene at, let's say past. That's probably the easiest for the Q&A.
Okay.
I'll turn off the recording too.